इंडोनेशिया के एक पुरसुकून मुज़ाफ़ाती इलाके में एक आम से घर के दरवाज़ों के पीछे धोखे और ख्वाहिश की कहानी जन्म ले रही थी। ये ख़ानदान बाहर से इज़्ज़तदार दिखाई देता था, मगर इसके अंदर एक ख़तरनाक राज छुपा हुआ था। ऐसा राज जो एतमाद को तोड़ देगा, रिश्तों को बर्बाद कर देगा और अंजामकार अलमिये में बदल जाएगा। ये सिर्फ बिगड़ते हुए ताल्लुक की कहानी नहीं, बल्कि एक हौलनाक सच है। सास और दामाद के दरमियान एक ममनुआ रिश्ता, जिसका कोई तसव्वुर भी नहीं कर सकता था।
In a quiet Indonesian village, life often moved at a gentle pace, untouched by the chaos of the cities. Families lived close, neighbors trusted one another, and traditions were held tightly. Among them was Norma, a woman known for her graceful personality and calm presence. She had lived most of her life as a devoted wife and mother, carrying herself with quiet dignity. People admired her for her hospitality, her ability to keep peace in the household, and the way she seemed to hold the family together during difficult times. To outsiders, Norma's life appeared steady and ordinary, but behind the doors of her home, a silent storm was beginning to gather. Her son-in-law, Arman, had entered the family just a year earlier through marriage with Norma's only daughter. He was younger, ambitious, and polite, the kind of man every parent would want for their child. At first, the relationship between him and Norma was built on respect. She treated him like a son, and he treated her like the elder figure he was expected to honor. But emotions are rarely simple, and human hearts often wander into dangerous territory. It began with harmless moments that no one noticed, a casual glance across the room that lasted longer than it should have, a small smile exchanged during quiet evenings, a conversation that lingered after everyone else had gone to sleep. These little moments, insignificant on their own, slowly built a thread of connection between them. Norma found herself drawn to Arman's youthful energy and attentiveness. He, in return, felt a strange comfort in Norma's maturity, her ability to understand him in ways others could not. The bond was not spoken of, yet it grew silently like a shadow stretching across the ground at sunset. Norma would catch herself thinking of him at times she shouldn't. Arman, too, began to notice the pull, though neither dared put it into words. They convinced themselves that what they felt was harmless, that nothing was truly happening, and yet deep inside they both knew a line was being crossed slowly, dangerously. Norma's household began to change in ways that seemed subtle, but were impossible to ignore for those who lived closest. She smiled more often, but it was a smile filled with something unexplainable. She dressed with unusual care, paying attention to details she had long ignored. There was a light in her eyes that had been missing for years. To the community, she looked like a woman rediscovering joy. To her daughter, the changes were harder to place, but they created a sense of unease. In the silence of her nights, Norma wrestled with guilt. She knew what was forming was wrong, but her heart was betraying her sense of duty. Every time she promised herself to end the feelings, another moment with Arman would break that resolve. Love, when mixed with secrecy and fear, turns into something intoxicating, and Norma found herself unable to resist. No one outside the home suspected anything. To the world, Norma remained the perfect mother, and Arman the loyal husband. But beneath the calm surface, a dangerous story was already being written, one that would eventually bring ruin, betrayal, and tragedy to all of them. Secrets are fragile things, and no matter how carefully they are hidden, they leave behind traces that can never be fully erased. In Norma's house, the silence that once felt peaceful slowly began to change into something heavy and suffocating. The closeness between her and Arman deepened with every passing week, and what had once been only stolen glances and innocent conversations now carried an unmistakable weight. The boundaries that should have protected the family were quietly dissolving. Arman began to distance himself from his wife, spending less time at her side and more time drifting toward Norma. Excuses became a pattern. He was tired, he had work, he needed space, and slowly his marriage began to lose its warmth. Norma's daughter noticed the coldness, but she explained it away to herself, believing that perhaps her husband was simply adjusting to new responsibilities. She had no reason yet to imagine the truth, for to think such a thing was unthinkable. Norma's guilt grew heavier with every moment she spent in Arman's presence. At night she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, hearing echoes of her conscience that scolded her for betraying her daughter. Yet, when morning came and she saw Arman, those voices grew faint, silenced by the dangerous comfort she felt in him. She avoided her daughter's eyes during meals, afraid that one look might expose everything she was hiding. She tried to convince herself that what was happening was only temporary, that she could stop it if she truly wanted to, but the truth was that the bond had already become stronger than her will. Outside the home, whispers began to stir. Villages are places where nothing stays hidden forever, and even the smallest details become subjects of conversation. A neighbor mentioned seeing Norma and Arman walking together late one evening. Another claimed to have noticed the way they spoke in hushed tones, their bodies too close for comfort. These whispers spread in quiet corners of the community, but without proof. They remained only rumors. Still, the air around Norma's family began to thicken with suspicion. Within the walls of the house, the daughter felt a growing unease. She could not explain it, but she sensed a distance between herself and the two people she loved most. She tried to reach out to her mother, asking if something was wrong, but Norma brushed her off with forced smiles. She tried to connect with Arman, but he often gave her distracted answers, his mind elsewhere. Nights grew longer, and the silence between husband and wife became almost unbearable. The tension wrapped itself around the family like a tightening rope. Arman no longer cared to hide his attachment, while Norma battled between her shame and her addiction to the secret. They both knew they were standing on dangerous ground, but the more forbidden it became, the more irresistible it was. In quiet moments, Norma would look at her reflection and fail to recognize the woman staring back at her. She was a mother, a wife, a figure of respect, and yet she was also someone who had betrayed the most sacred bond of trust. That contradiction ate away at her, but instead of pulling her back, it drove her deeper into the secrecy. The cracks in their hidden world were no longer invisible. They were spreading quickly, like fractures in glass, and once they broke open, the truth would spill out in a way that could never be controlled again. The day that shattered the fragile silence arrived without warning, as though fate itself had chosen the moment to rip away the curtain of secrecy. Norma's daughter returned home earlier than usual, her footsteps quiet as she entered the house. She expected to find her mother in the kitchen or her husband resting after work, but instead she heard voices carried softly through the walls. At first, the words were indistinct, blurred by distance, but the tone was unmistakable, gentle, intimate, filled with warmth that should never have been shared between those two voices. A coldness rushed through her chest as she followed the sound, each step heavier than the last. When her eyes finally caught sight of the truth, her world collapsed in a single heartbeat. There, in her own home, stood the two people she trusted most, bound together in a way that no daughter or wife should ever have to witness. It was not only betrayal, it was a cruelty so deep it stole the air from her lungs. In that moment, the life she thought she knew dissolved before her eyes. Her husband was no longer the partner she had loved, and her mother was no longer the safe place she had always relied upon. Both had crossed a line that destroyed every bond of trust. Her scream filled the air, shattering the illusion of secrecy in an instant. Norma froze, guilt flooding her face, while Arman stumbled back in shock, his composure broken. The confrontation tore through the house with the force of a storm. Words spilled out in a flood, accusations, denials, desperate apologies, all tangled together until they became a blur of raw emotion. Norma collapsed to her knees, begging for forgiveness, her tears staining the floor. Arman tried to explain, his words frantic and hollow, but nothing he said could erase the sight that had already burned itself into his wife's memory. The daughter's heart broke into pieces that could never be mended. The betrayal was not just from one person, but from both. The two people who should have stood at the core of her life had joined together to destroy it. She left the house in a whirlwind of rage and grief, her body trembling with disbelief. For days, she wandered between silence and despair, unable to tell the full truth to anyone. Shame pinned her down. How could she face the community with a story so twisted? How could she admit that her own mother had stolen her husband? Norma tried to reach her, but every attempt was met with rejection. The daughter shut herself off, retreating into a world of loneliness and suspicion. Nights became unbearable. She replayed the moment over and over, the images seared into her mind. Each memory tightened around her chest like iron chains. Norma's guilt only deepened, yet instead of ending the relationship, she allowed herself to sink further into Arman's grasp. He whispered promises of love, insisting that what they shared was worth the destruction. His recklessness only fueled the fire, pulling Norma further away from redemption. The daughter, broken and abandoned, felt cornered by betrayal and silence. It was in that suffocating darkness that her pain began to transform into something far more dangerous, a plan that would bring their hidden story to its violent end. The silence inside the house grew heavier with every passing day, as though the walls themselves carried the weight of betrayal. Norma's daughter moved through the rooms like a ghost, her eyes hollow and her heart consumed by bitterness. The discovery of the secret had left her shattered, but the deeper wound came from knowing there was no escape from it. Each time she looked at her mother, she saw deceit. Each time her gaze fell on her husband, she saw cruelty. Living under the same roof became unbearable, yet she could not bring herself to leave. The shame was too great, and the thought of the community learning the truth froze her in place. Her rage began as a spark, small and fleeting, but soon it grew into a fire that burned without rest. Sleep abandoned her. In its place came visions of her mother and husband together, haunting her at every hour. She tried to silence the images, but they returned relentlessly, feeding her anger until it transformed into something darker. She felt like a prisoner in her own home, cornered by betrayal, and in that prison, she began to plan. Norma and Arman, lost in their obsession, seemed blind to the storm building inside the daughter. They carried on with reckless confidence, believing that nothing worse could happen now that their secret was exposed within the family. Norma clung to Arman as though he was her last chance at happiness, ignoring the destruction left behind. Arman, arrogant and careless, treated the daughter's pain as a temporary wound that time would heal. Neither of them saw how deeply she had been broken, nor did they imagine that the woman they had betrayed was slowly preparing to end it all. One stormy night, when the rain hammered against the roof and the winds howled like warnings from the dark, the daughter made her move. Hidden beneath her clothes was a knife from the kitchen, its cold steel pressing against her skin as a reminder of the decision she had made. Her body trembled, not with hesitation, but with a strange, desperate determination. She stepped into the living room where Norma and Arman sat together, their bodies close, their laughter low and intimate. The sight ignited everything she had been holding back. She moved quickly, her fury giving her strength she never knew she had. The blade struck Arman first, sinking into him before he could react. His body collapsed to the ground, blood blooming across the floor like a spreading shadow. Norma screamed, rushing forward, but her daughter's rage did not pause. The knife turned on her next, tearing through the bond of mother and child with a finality that no words could undo. When the silence returned, it was deafening. The two bodies lay lifeless, their forbidden love extinguished in a pool of blood. The daughter stood trembling, the knife slipping from her hands, her breath ragged. She stared at what she had done, unable to move, unable to undo the horror that had unfolded. The storm outside raged on, as though the night itself bore witness to the tragedy that had destroyed an entire family in a single act of vengeance. The night of bloodshed marked the end of the secret, but it was only the beginning of the aftermath. The neighbors, alarmed by the piercing screams and sudden silence, rushed toward the house. When the door was forced open, the sight inside left them speechless. Norma and Arman lay lifeless on the floor, their bodies soaked in blood, their faces frozen in expressions of shock and terror. Standing over them was the daughter, her clothes stained, her hands trembling, her eyes vacant. The knife that had carried out the act rested on the ground at her feet. For a moment, no one spoke. The air was thick with disbelief, and the house that once seemed ordinary had become the stage of an unimaginable crime. The police arrived quickly, summoned by frantic neighbors. They found the daughter sitting in silence, staring blankly into the distance, as though her soul had already left her body. She did not resist when they questioned her, nor when they took her away. Instead, she confessed in a voice stripped of all emotion. She spoke of betrayal, of nights haunted by visions, of the unbearable weight of her mother's and husband's disloyalty. Her words shocked even the most experienced officers, who had heard countless tales of crime, but rarely one so twisted by love, secrecy, and rage. The news spread across the community with the speed of wildfire. People who once admired Norma now whispered her name with disgust. She had been respected for her grace and strength, but her hidden weakness had led her down a path that destroyed her family. Arman's reputation, too, was reduced to nothing. Instead of being remembered as a dutiful husband, his name became synonymous with betrayal. The daughter, meanwhile, was caught in a storm of opinion. Some saw her as a murderer who had committed an unforgivable act, while others believed she was a victim driven to madness by the cruelty of those who should have protected her. The trial was swift. Every detail of the family's hidden life was dragged into the open. The court listened to the confessions, the testimonies, the evidence of betrayal that had poisoned the home. When the verdict was delivered, the daughter was sentenced to years in prison. Her punishment was sealed, yet her story divided hearts. To some, she was a criminal who had taken 2 lives. To others, she was a broken woman who had snapped under the unbearable weight of deceit. The house where it had all happened was left abandoned. No one dared to live there again. Locals claimed that at night faint sounds could still be heard, whispers, cries, and the echoes of the storm that had accompanied the tragedy. It became a place avoided, a reminder of how darkness can grow silently in the most trusted corners of a home. Norma's name lived on, not as a symbol of grace, but as a warning. Arman's story faded into shame, and the daughter, locked away behind bars, carried the heaviest burden of all, the memory of what she had done, and the unending question of whether she was truly guilty or simply destroyed by those she loved most. The tale of their downfall became a shadow that lingered, a tragic reminder that some secrets, once exposed, bring nothing but ruin.
ये कहानी सिर्फ एक खानदान की तबाही नहीं बल्कि इस खामोश जहर की अक्कास है जो ममनुआ रिश्ते फैला सकते हैं। आखिरकार सच छप ना सका और अंजाम ऐसा हुआ जिसने सबको लर्जा दिया। ये एक सबक है कि छुपे हुए राज हमेशा अंधेरों को जन्म देते हैं।